They said the machine was broken. They were right, it was broken enough to win. The light on the recorder had been green for 11 seconds before Elena Vasquez said anything. She was sitting in a chair that wasn't built for comfort, bolted to a gray floor in a gray room under gray fluorescent light, and her hands were folded on the table in front of her with the careful deliberateness of someone who had decided, consciously and in advance, that she was not going to let them shake. There was a cut above her left eyebrow, sealed with medical tape that had started to peel at one corner. Her jacket had a long tear across the left shoulder, the synthetic insulation inside bunched and yellowed like old cotton. She smelled like smoke and pine resin and something else, something chemical and faintly sweet that the agents in the room had stopped trying to identify. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said. "I'm a third-year mechanical engineering student at Raleigh-Whitmore University. As of 6 days ago," she paused. "I don't know if the university still exists. I haven't been told." The man across the table, he had given her a name she hadn't retained, a first name and a last name both so generic they functioned as no name at all, clicked the end of his pen twice. Not writing anything, just clicking. "I want to start with the machine," he said. "I know you do," Elena said. "Everyone does. Nobody wants to start with Marcus. Nobody wants to start with what happened to the Hendersons' farm." She looked at the recording device, small, black, sitting in the exact center of the table as though it had been measured. But the machine didn't happen without Marcus, and Marcus didn't happen without the farm. So I'm starting at the beginning, and you can edit it down to whatever you need later. The man clicked his pen once more. Then he put it down flat on the table and said, "Go ahead." Elena Vasquez took a breath. "We called it the Hornet," she said. "Marcus named it. He said it was because hornets were the only flying things that attacked without being provoked. They just decided something was a threat and then they dealt with it, and they didn't stop until the threat was gone or they were. I thought it was a stupid name at the time." A pause, a ghost of something on her face that wasn't quite a smile. "I don't think that anymore." It began, the way most genuinely catastrophic things begin, with something small going wrong. The access road to the Henderson property was 3 miles of gravel and good intentions. It connected the university's experimental systems lab to the 800 acres of fallow pasture that Dr. Ansel Whitmore had leased from the Henderson family at the beginning of the semester. The arrangement was unofficial, the kind of thing that existed because the university's official testing grounds were booked 18 months in advance, and Dr. Whitmore had known Greta Henderson since they were both graduate students, and she trusted him not to burn anything down. The lease was verbal. The insurance coverage was optimistic. The liability, as Marcus had once pointed out during a budget meeting, was, quote, "enormous and distributed equally among people who didn't fully understand what they'd agreed to." That had been 6 weeks ago. The three of them, Elena, Marcus Webb, and Kala Osai, had been living out of tents on the northeastern corner of the property since the beginning of October, running systems tests on the Hornet during the days and arguing about power consumption metrics at night over whatever they'd pulled from the cooler. Dr. Whitmore drove out every third day with supplies and feedback and increasingly pointed observations about their projected timeline, which was already 6 weeks behind where it needed to be. The Hornet was not, by any reasonable external measure, an impressive machine. It stood 11 feet tall when fully extended, which it rarely was, because fully extended meant the joint stabilizers in the lower leg assembly were under load that made Elena nervous. Its primary chassis was a modified industrial exoskeleton frame, the kind used in heavy construction and disaster relief, that Marcus had sourced from a surplus liquidation auction for $2,200 and a promissory note. Over that frame, across 18 months of work and 3 complete rebuilds, the three of them had built something that was no longer recognizable as an exoskeleton, and not quite recognizable as anything else. It had an onboard processing system Marcus had assembled from salvaged components, and 2 custom boards he'd fabricated in the university's maker space. It had a haptic feedback network threaded through the chassis that let the pilot feel surface resistance and structural stress as pressure changes in a vest they wore. It had a sensor array on the upper chassis that could map terrain in 3 dimensions at a range of 40 meters and feed that data to the pilot's headset in real time. It had 2 heavy manipulator arms that could exert 800 pounds of force each and were precise enough, at low speed, to pick up an egg without cracking it, though Marcus had only demonstrated this once, and Alina suspected it had taken him 40 attempts to get right. What it did not have, as of the first week of October, was any reliable way to take more than 3 steps in rapid succession without the gate stabilization algorithm throwing a fault and locking the legs. This was the problem they had come to the Henderson property to solve. The second problem, the one they hadn't known about yet, the one that was arriving from the other side of the sky, while Alina sat in the field one evening eating cold soup from a can and watching the stars come out, was of a different order entirely. She didn't know, watching that sky, that what she was looking at had been watched by other eyes first, studied, cataloged, assessed. She didn't know that the 6 points of light she'd noticed 3 nights running and assumed were satellites were not satellites. She didn't know that something had decided from a remove of several thousand feet that this patch of earth and the animals moving across it were worth a second look. She didn't know any of that. She finished her soup and went to bed. The first brainwashed person any of them saw was a ranger named Graves. He came out of the tree line along the western edge of the property at 7 in the morning, 3 days after Alina had eaten her soup under the wrong kind of stars. He was moving wrong. That was the first thing Calla noticed, standing outside the equipment tent with a coffee thermos in her hand. Moving wrong in the way that animals sometimes moved wrong. The way a dog moved when it had eaten something it shouldn't have, functional but slightly misaligned with the world around it, operating on signals that didn't quite sync with the environment. Calla called for Alina. Alina came out of the tent. Ranger Graves stopped about 20 meters away and looked at them. His face was expressionless in a way that was different from simple blankness. It was the absence of whatever process usually produced expression, like a screen with no input signal. His eyes were tracking them. He was clearly registering their presence. He was not reacting to it in any way that mapped onto any human behavioral pattern either of them could access. "Hey," Alina said. "Hey, you okay?" Graves walked toward them, not fast, just steadily. "Hey," Alina raised a hand. "Hey, stop, can you hear me?" He didn't stop. Marcus came out of the equipment tent behind Alina. He'd heard her voice from inside and knew the particular flat tone she used when she was calm on the outside and not calm anywhere else. And he saw Graves coming and said, "What is that?" And Alina said, "I don't know," and Marcus said, "We should get back," and Alina agreed. They backed into the tent. Graves stopped at the tent entrance and stood there, just stood there, for 4 minutes. Then he turned around and walked back into the tree line. None of them said anything for a while. "Stroke," Calla said eventually. "Could be a stroke, dissociative episode, something neurological." "We should call it in," Marcus said. "Who do we call?" He was wearing a Forest Service badge. "Do we call the Forest Service and say their ranger is acting weird?" "We call 911. We say we saw someone who might need medical attention. And then people come out here, and we spend 2 days explaining what we're doing and Dr. Whitmore." "Calla," Alina said quietly. They both looked at her. "We call 911, she said, "right now." They called. The dispatcher took the information and said they'd send someone when they could, and the when they could had a quality to it that made Alina understand, in an abstract way she couldn't yet articulate, that something was happening that was bigger than one ranger walking wrong at the edge of a tree line. She asked the dispatcher if everything was okay. The dispatcher said they were experiencing a high volume of calls, and then the line dropped. They stood in the field for a moment. "I'm going to run diagnostics on the primary movement system," Marcus said. His voice was very steady. He used that voice when he was frightened and didn't want anyone to know. Alina had known him for 3 years and could read the tells. "We were going to do it today anyway." "Yeah," Alina said. "Probably nothing to worry about." "Probably not." Neither of them believed this. But it was something to do, and having something to do was, in Alina's experience, always better than standing in a field waiting for information that wasn't coming. By noon, 3 more people had come out of the tree line. Different people: a man in a flannel jacket, a woman in running clothes, an older man with a walking stick he wasn't using correctly. They all moved the same way Graves had moved. They all stopped at roughly the same distance from the camp. They all stood. They all eventually turned and walked back into the trees. The 5th one didn't walk back. She was a teenager, maybe 16, in a school jacket with a name Amber embroidered above the left breast. She came out of the trees at 2 in the afternoon, moved toward the camp, and when Alina stepped forward and held up her hand and said, "Stop," the girl stopped. Alina approached her slowly, talking the whole time, the way you'd approach an animal you weren't sure about, not making sudden moves, keeping her hands visible. Up close, the girl's eyes were not right. Not injured, not bleeding, not clouded. They were responsive to light and movement. But there was a quality to them, a depth or a lack of depth, like looking at a window instead of through it, that made Alina's stomach tighten. "Hey," Alina said softly. "Amber, that your name, Amber?" The girl looked at her. "Can you hear me?" A pause, then very faint, like a signal pushing through interference. "Yes." Alina felt the muscles in her shoulders unlock slightly. "Okay, are you hurt?" Another pause, longer. "I don't know." "Okay, that's okay. Do you know where you are?" The girl's face did something then, a flicker, a crack in the blankness, a microsecond of something that looked like fear before it was smoothed away again, ironed out by whatever had hold of her. "They're in my head," she whispered. The words came out thin and strange, like she was borrowing a gap in something to say them. "They're showing me what they want me to do." "Who is?" But Amber's face went blank again. She turned and walked back toward the tree line without another word. Alina watched her go and did not follow. She went back to the equipment tent and sat on the ground next to the Hornet's left leg assembly and pressed her back against the cool metal and tried to think. Marcus came and sat next to her. He didn't say anything for a while. "Movement tests are done," he said eventually. "And it's better. The gate algorithm update I pushed last night is holding. Did 400 meters without a fault." A pause. "Still a prototype. Still has about 10 things that could go wrong under load." Alina nodded. "That girl. I know. Whatever it is, it's not neurological. Not all of them. Not the same presentation across different ages and body types," and he stopped. "It's external. Something is doing it to them from outside." Alina said nothing. "The lights," Marcus said. "The ones you mentioned, the ones you thought were satellites." "Yeah. I looked them up last night. No known satellites in those orbital positions. Not on any of the tracking databases." Silence. "Okay," Alina said finally. "Okay. Okay, so we deal with it." Marcus looked at her for a moment. He had a face that was usually in motion. He thought out loud, and his face thought too, every idea registering as it formed, but right now it was still. "How do we deal with it?" he said. Alina looked at the Hornet. "We finished fixing the machine," she said. What followed was 12 hours that Alina would later find almost impossible to describe in sequence, because they happened at a frequency that compressed time, made it dense and elastic, each minute containing more event than a minute could reasonably hold. Marcus went to the highest point on the property, a gentle rise at the field's northern edge, and stood there with his binoculars for 20 minutes while Elena and Kala ran the Hornet through its full range of motion tests. He called back on the radio twice. First call, he could see lights in the sky that were not aircraft, not weather balloons, not anything he had a framework for. Multiple sources, moving in formation. Second call, 4 minutes after the first, the lights were descending. They stopped the range of motion tests. What Marcus had seen, by the time the three of them stood on the rise and looked together, was something that had no business being in any sky that human beings had been building assumptions about for all of recorded history. There were 5 of them, 5 objects in a loose formation, perfectly stable in their positions relative to each other, moving in a silence that felt wrong because things that size, at that altitude, should have been making sound. They were roughly ovoid. They had no running lights, no exhaust trail, no visible means of propulsion. They were in the last light of the day, somewhere between bronze and black, and they were descending in a long, shallow arc toward the valley to the west. "Those are not ours," Kala said. Her voice was very quiet. "No," Elena agreed. "Those are not anybody's on this planet," Marcus said. He was doing the same thing he always did when something exceeded his model of the world. He was running calculations, visible on his face, trying to find the frame that could hold what he was looking at. He didn't find one. He watched the lights descend and his face went through several things and then went still. "Okay," he said, which was the word both he and Elena used when they had accepted something and were moving past it. "Okay, so." "So," Elena said. "They're doing something to people. The ranger, that girl, the other ones." "Mind control," Kala said flatly. "That's what it is. That's the frame. Use it." A pause. Both Elena and Marcus looked at her. Kala was the most precise thinker of the three of them. She had a low tolerance for imprecision in both language and analysis, and she generally didn't say things like mind control unless she'd already processed the alternatives. "Mind control," Elena agreed. "Whatever the mechanism, that's the functional description. They're taking people's motor control, possibly more, using them for, I don't know, scouting, disruption. Removing obstacles." "We're an obstacle," Marcus said. "If they saw us here, if they know about the—" he glanced back at the camp at the Hornet's upper chassis visible above the tent. "If they know about it." "They might not," Kala said. "We're 3 people in a field, we might be beneath notice." This turned out to be optimistic. The radio, when they got back to camp, was producing nothing but static on every channel. Elena's phone had no signal. Kala's had 1 bar that flickered and vanished when she tried to use it. Marcus's was completely dead, which wasn't necessarily related. Marcus's phone had been dying in stages for 3 weeks, but felt related. They stood in the camp and looked at each other. The thing about Elena Vasquez, the thing that the people who knew her well had eventually identified as the core of her, was not her intelligence, though she was genuinely intelligent. It was not her stubbornness, though that was significant. It was the particular relationship she had with fear. She felt it fully, processed it completely, and then she folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and continued doing what needed to be done. She did not suppress fear. She did not deny it. She carried it with her as useful information, and then she worked. She had been afraid every day of the field tests, afraid of the 11-foot machine she'd helped build and didn't entirely trust and was responsible for, afraid of the liability Marcus had mentioned, the enormous distributed liability, afraid of the night sounds in a field that was not her natural environment, a city girl perpetually startled by how dark the actual dark was. She had folded all of it and put it in her pocket and worked. She did the same now. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we know. There are objects in the sky that aren't ours. They're doing something to people in the area, taking away their autonomy, making them into something. The extent of our communication with the outside is currently 0. We have the Hornet, which passed range of motion tests today and is functional but untested under any kind of stress load. That last part is worth dwelling on, Marcus said. I know I'm dwelling on it. It's never been in an actual load scenario. We've never pushed it against resistance. We've never pushed it fast. I know all of that. The gate algorithm update I pushed this morning has been running for 6 hours. That's not a testing period. That's barely a warm-up. Marcus. He stopped. I know, she said again. I know all of it. I know every way it can fail and every system that hasn't been tested and every assumption we built into the design that might not hold. I've been carrying all of that for 18 months. But right now, what I need you to tell me is what it can do. Not what it might fail at. What it can do. Marcus was quiet for a moment. It can walk, he said. For probably a mile before we start risking a fault. It can lift the equivalent of a small car with both arms. It's got the sensor array running clean. I checked it an hour ago, 40-meter range, high resolution. The haptic system is functional, he paused. And it's got you. Elena looked at him. The Hornet is a tool, he said. It's an 11-foot tool. Tools don't think, you think. You've been thinking about this machine every day for a year and a half. You know every system, every weakness, every workaround. The machine might fail, but you won't. Calla was watching them both. She had her arms crossed, not defensively, just holding herself together, the Calla equivalent of a tight formation. So we're doing it, she said. It wasn't a question. We're doing something, Elena said. I don't know yet if that something involves getting in the machine or running. But we're not doing nothing. Good, Calla said, because something's coming. She was looking at the tree line. 3 figures had emerged, more behind them. The shapes were wrong, they were too coordinated, moving together in a way that crowds of people didn't naturally move, each pace synchronized to the others with a precision that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with something else driving them. Elena counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. Marcus, she said very quietly, get the Hornet startup sequence ready. The startup sequence took 90 seconds. Marcus had it memorized: power cells to primary bus, hydraulic pressure to nominal, haptic system handshake, sensor array initialization, gate algorithm load, pilot interface sync. 90 seconds if you moved through it without hesitation, which Marcus did, his hands going through the motions with the automaticity of someone who had done this hundreds of times in practice, and was now calling on all of those repetitions at once. Elena pulled on the haptic vest. It settled against her like familiar weight. She'd worn it so many times it had taken the shape of her. She checked the pilot headset. Sensor data loaded. A 3-dimensional map of the surrounding 40 meters resolving itself in real time. The approaching figures rendered as amber clusters moving toward the center of the display. 17, she said, reading the cluster count. More in the trees, Calla said. She was at the camp's supply chest, pulling out the one piece of equipment they'd brought for emergencies and hoped not to use, a flare gun, orange and industrial, designed for maritime distress signals. I can see movement. I don't know how many. Elena stepped into the Hornet's pilot bay, a recessed cradle at the machine's center of gravity, framed by the chassis struts. The restraint system clicked into place across her chest and waist. She felt the haptic vest sync with the machine, a brief full-body pulse of sensation, like a breath, like the machine acknowledging her, and then she was in. This was the part she never knew how to describe to people who hadn't experienced it. The Hornet did not feel like operating machinery. Operating machinery felt like controlling something external, something you pushed and pulled and directed with levers and buttons. This felt like extension, like the machine was a second body, heavier and taller and made of metal but continuous with her own. The haptic network translated the world into sensation, the pressure of the ground under the machine's feet, the resistance of the air, the vibration in the chassis when she shifted weight. She felt 11 feet tall. She felt like she was made of something that could take a hit. She stepped out of the equipment tent. The brainwashed people, and she thought of them that way deliberately as people first and threats second, because she knew that mattered had closed to about 30 meters. They'd spread out into a loose arc. They were not running. They moved with the same steady, unhurried certainty of something that had calculated the outcome and found it favorable. Alina stepped forward once, twice. The gate algorithm held. The ground was uneven field grass patchy, with low spots that she felt as subtle changes in the haptic feedback, and she adjusted her weight distribution the way she'd trained herself to adjust it, feeling for the machine's center of mass the way you felt for your own balance. "Hornet," said Marcus's voice in her earpiece. It was the word he used to mean ready, a habit they'd developed so that confirmation didn't require a sentence, just one word. "Hornet," she said back, which meant the same thing. She walked toward the arc of approaching figures and raised both arms, not aggressively, just raised them, palms of the Hornet's heavy manipulators turned outward. A signal, a gesture. She had no idea if it would register. She tried anyway. "Stop," she said. Her voice through the Hornet's external speaker was bass-heavy, wrong, loud enough to carry across the field. "We don't want to hurt you. Stop." Most of them didn't stop. Two did. Just two. The ones at the outer edges of the arc. The ones whose control link to whatever was driving them might have been slightly attenuated by distance. They stopped and stood, and their faces showed the same flickering crack Alina had seen in Amber's face earlier, the brief terror of someone who knew something was wrong and couldn't articulate it. The rest came forward. What Alina did next was something she had never practiced, never planned for, never even imagined as a use case when she and Marcus had been arguing about actuator specifications 18 months ago. She moved the Hornet between the advancing figures and Calla and Marcus, planted its feet wide, lowered its center of gravity, and held her ground. Not attacking, not striking. Just holding a wall, a brace, an 11-foot thing made of metal and resolve that was standing in the way and not moving. The first person to reach her walked into the Hornet's torso at full walking speed and bounced off it. They were not injured. The Hornet was not damaged. The person got up, registered the obstacle, and tried to find a way around it, and Alina shifted left to cut them off, and the haptic feedback registered the pressure of a second person hitting the right arm, and she extended the arm and applied gentle outward pressure. Not a strike, a redirect, and the person stumbled sideways and fell and got up again. It was the most undignified version of a fight she could have imagined. She was essentially being a turnstile, a very large, very slow turnstile, redirecting a stream of people who were trying to get past her to where Marcus and Calla were standing. She had not trained for this. Nothing in her engineering background or her field test experience had prepared her for the strange, exhausted intimacy of it. But it was working. She held them for 7 minutes. 7 minutes of shuffling, redirecting, blocking, the gate algorithm holding through all of it with a stability that she registered somewhere behind her eyes as a kind of gratitude. 7 minutes until the lights in the sky moved. She saw them with the sensor array first. The array tracked airborne objects when they entered its range, flagged them automatically as unknown if they didn't match any pattern in its reference database. 2 of the 5 ships had peeled off from the formation and were descending toward the field. They appeared on her display as large, slow-moving masses at altitude, and they appeared on her eyes a moment later as 2 dark ovoids dropping through the low cloud layer, lit from below by whatever light they themselves emitted, bronze and cold. The brainwashed figures stopped. All of them, simultaneously, stopped moving and turned to face the descending ships. Alina stood very still inside the Hornet and watched. What the ships did when they reached low altitude was not what she expected. She had, in the 15 minutes she'd had to develop expectations, developed several scenarios in order of plausibility, none of which involved what actually happened. The ships did not power up visible weapons systems. They did not project anything. They simply descended to about 200 feet above the field, and then they held there, and the air around them did something that Alina had no word for: not pressure, not sound, not radiation, but a quality that her haptic vest registered as full-body static, a vibration at a frequency just below anything that had a name. The brainwashed people sat down, not collapsed, sat down, controlled as if instructed. The two who had stopped earlier and shown signs of partial autonomy did not sit down. They stood and looked at each other, and then at Alina, and the Hornet with expressions that were raw and confused and frightened and real. Alina looked at the ships. The ships looked, she felt this, rather than saw it, felt it as a shift in the haptic static, a change in the directionality of the frequency at the Hornet. They had not been expecting it. That was her first clear read on them, the first piece of genuine intelligence she'd had about whatever was up there in those ships. They had not been expecting the machine. The people on the ground, the buildings, the trees, those were all within some model they'd built. The machine was not. She could feel the uncertainty of it, the slight asynchronous quality in the way the ships held their positions, like a person discovering that the room they thought they knew has a door they hadn't seen. Marcus's voice in her ear: "They're targeting you." "I know. The sensor array is picking up a directed signal, concentrated, aimed at you, at the Hornet, like what they're doing to people, but I'm not a person," Alina said. "Right. It won't work on the machine. The machine doesn't have neurons. The signal needs neurons." "They don't know that," Alina said. "They've never seen a machine like this." A pause. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked. Alina was thinking several things simultaneously. She was thinking about the gate algorithm and how many consecutive rapid steps she could push it through before she'd risk a fault. She was thinking about the lifting capacity of the manipulator arms and what she could reach at 200 feet of altitude. She was thinking about the haptic static from the ships and whether the machine could hold up under prolonged exposure, and whether she could, and what it would feel like if she couldn't. She was also thinking about what the ships were, not what they were mechanically or physically, but what they were categorically, what kind of entity they represented, something that had crossed an incomprehensible distance to find this planet. Something that had looked at the human beings here and decided they were a resource to be organized, a labor pool to be directed, a problem to be solved. Something that had never, not once in all its assessment and preparation, and descending arcs through human skies, imagined that the organisms below might build something to fight back with. "I'm thinking," she said, "that they made a mistake." She charged them. Not in a straight line. The field had too many variables. The brainwashed figures were still on the ground, and she wasn't going to risk harming them. The terrain between her and the point directly below the ships was broken and uncertain. She cut left, found the flattest path her sensor array had mapped, and went. The Hornet at full stride was not elegant. It had never been designed for full stride. It had been designed for controlled movement, for precision, for the careful allocation of force. At full stride it was all of its imperfections at once. The slight asymmetry in the left hip actuator Marcus had been meaning to fix, the millisecond delay in the gate algorithm's left-to-right weight transfer, the vibration in the torso chassis that started above a certain speed, and that Alina had learned to read as the machine saying, "You're pushing me harder than I'd like." She pushed it harder than it liked. The gate algorithm, the one Marcus had updated at 3 in the morning the night before based on 6 weeks of incremental data, held. She reached the midpoint of the field at a speed that neither she nor Marcus had ever pushed the Hornet to. The sensor array screaming amber alerts about terrain irregularities that she was processing and overriding in real time. The haptic vest full of sensation, pressure and vibration, and the wrongness of the ship frequency building against the chassis. The ships responded. She felt them respond. The frequency increased, the directed signal intensified, and the quality of it changed from probing to something she didn't have a word for, something that if she'd had to guess she'd have called alarm. They were escalating, trying harder, trying to reach something inside the machine that wasn't there to reach. She reached the base of the nearest ship's hovering position, directly beneath it, 200 feet of air between her and its hull, and she planted the Hornet's feet and she looked up. The sensor array mapped it in 3 dimensions. It was big, bigger than it had looked from across the field, bigger than the ovoid silhouette against the clouded sky had suggested. Maybe 80 feet across, smooth-surfaced with a texture that wasn't quite metal and wasn't quite anything else. No seams visible, no obvious propulsion mechanism. It hummed at a frequency that the haptic vest translated as something between pressure and cold. Alina looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then she reached up with both of the Hornet's arms, 800 pounds of force each, the maximum the manipulators could generate, found the lowest edge of the ship's hull, and pulled. The thing about that moment, the thing she kept coming back to in the months after, in the gray room and then later in her own time, alone with it, the thing that mattered most was not what happened when she pulled. It was the moment before. The second where she had her hands on something that had come from somewhere incomprehensibly far away, that had crossed distances she couldn't calculate, that had arrived at Earth with a confidence that implied it had done this before, many times on many worlds, and found it straightforward. She had her hands on it. The machine's hands, which were also her hands, which were also in some sense the product of everything she and Marcus and Calla had built and rebuilt and argued about, and refused to give up on. And she felt the ship flinch. Not move, not recoil. Flinch, a microsecond of something in the frequency, a stutter in the signal that was structurally identical to surprise. She recognized it because she had felt it in herself, that involuntary half-second before the body catches up with what the mind has processed, the moment of pure animal reaction before the rational response can form. She had surprised it. An 11-foot machine made of salvage and student grants and 18 months of accumulated stubbornness had put its hands on a ship that had crossed the stars, and the ship had not known how to predict that. She used the second it took them to recalibrate. The manipulator arms couldn't move the ship. She knew that. The physics were obvious. 2 arms generating 1,600 pounds combined force against an object of unknown but certainly massive inertia. But they could create contact. And contact, it turned out, had effects. The ship's hull was not inert under pressure. She could feel it through the haptic vest, a response to the mechanical input, something that moved through the surface and into whatever interior structure the ship had. Not damage, not structural compromise, but disruption, a wave of something that moved through the hull and made the ship's frequency stutter and change. The directed signal, the one they'd been using on the people, cut out entirely. Across the field, the brainwashed figures made sounds, not screams, not words, just sounds, exhalations, as if 17 people had simultaneously been released from something that had been compressing them. Several of them began to cry. A few got up, unsteadily, looking at their hands and at the sky and at the world around them with the expressions of people who didn't know yet where they were but knew they'd been somewhere else. The ship rose sharply. Alina lost her grip. The manipulators slammed back into their rest position, and the Hornet staggered, and the gate algorithm through the fault she'd been pushing against the whole time, locked the legs for 3 seconds, 3 seconds of paralysis. The machine braced against the ground while she felt the weight of it without mobility, felt it in the haptic vest as stillness that wanted to be something else. 3 seconds. She was counting. 1. The second ship descended toward her, not hovering, coming down fast with an intention that was different from what the ships had shown before. Less survey, more response. She was, she realized, no longer beneath notice. She had become the specific thing they were addressing. 2. Marcus's voice in her ear, very fast. The fault, it's the left hip actuator. I saw the data, the preload setting. When it releases, you need to shift your weight right before you push off or it'll fault again. 3. The gate algorithm unlocked. She shifted her weight right and pushed off, and the Hornet moved, and it didn't fault. What followed was 23 minutes of something that didn't have a clean name and probably never would. It wasn't a fight in any conventional sense. She had no weapons. The ships had no weapons she could reach, and the brainwashed people were no longer a factor, most of them having scattered across the field or collapsed in exhaustion. It was something more like a negotiation conducted in physics. The ships pushed. She moved. She created contact. They responded. She used the sensor array to track their positions and find the gaps in their formation, used the gate algorithm at limits it had never seen, pushed the haptic system through readings that Marcus later told her were 3 times what the vest had been rated for. Calla shot the flare gun twice. Once toward the sky, not at anything specific, just a signal, a column of burning orange rising from the field in a long arc. And once, from the edge of the tree line where she'd moved to get a sightline, directly at the hull of the lower ship from a distance of about 40 feet, which did nothing to the ship itself, but lit up the underside of the hull in vivid red-orange for about 4 seconds and seemed, based on the subsequent behavior of the ship, to register as a novel input that required recategorization. Whether that recategorization was to their advantage or not, Alina never established. But it bought 6 seconds of hesitation. She used all of them. The fault she'd been managing, the left hip actuator, the preload setting Marcus had identified, came back at the 21-minute mark. Longer lock this time. 5 seconds. She held the machine's position on the ground, legs locked, upper body twisting to track the second ship's position, and thought clearly and completely about whether she was going to be able to finish this. Finish it as what, she didn't know. Drive them off. Make them decide the cost was wrong. She didn't need to defeat them. She wasn't capable of defeating them, not in any absolute sense, not with an 11-foot machine made of salvage and resolve. What she needed to do was something simpler and in some ways harder. She needed to demonstrate that this planet, this piece of land, this field, contained something they hadn't planned for, something that fought back when touched, something that had looked at them from below and decided, without the benefit of interstellar transit or advanced materials science, or 1,000 years of development ahead of whatever humanity currently had, decided that enough was enough. The fault released. She rose. The ships, she read this in the sensor array, in the change in their positioning relative to each other and relative to her, were recalibrating again, moving back from each other slightly, adjusting altitude. The quality of the frequency they projected had changed again, shifted from alarm back towards something that felt, through the haptic translation, like assessment, like something deciding. She stood in the field and looked up at them and waited. After 40 seconds, she counted they rose, not quickly. Not in the urgent, reactive way they'd been moving in the last few minutes of the engagement. Slowly, in the measured way they descended, with the quality of deliberate choice. They rose and rejoined the 3 ships still holding their formation at higher altitude, and then all 5 of them moved in the direction of the valley they'd originally come from, and the sky got lighter as they went, and after 3 more minutes there was nothing there that hadn't been there before. The field was very quiet. Alina stood in the Hornet and breathed. She became aware, slowly, of the sounds around her. Someone weeping nearby, the low sound of wind through the grass, a bird that had apparently decided the crisis was over and was saying so to no one in particular. She became aware of Marcus in her earpiece, not talking, just there. She could hear his breathing, and she understood he had been holding his breath and had now let it go. "Hornet," she said quietly. A pause, then his voice rough and warm and very tired. "Hornet." It took 4 hours for anyone official to arrive. In those 4 hours, a lot happened, and some of it was hard, and some of it was necessary, and all of it was work. The 17 people who'd been in the field needed attention, not medical attention in most cases. The effects of the controls seemed to be dissipating on their own, but human attention, the kind that said you're here and you're real and something happened to you and it wasn't your fault. Kala was the best of them at this, sitting with people on the grass and listening to them and not offering explanations because she understood that explanations could wait and presence couldn't. Marcus worked on the Hornet. He spent 2 of those 4 hours going through every system, running diagnostics, taking notes on a tablet. He found 7 things that had been stressed beyond their design parameters. He found the left hip actuator preload issue and fixed it with a tool from his jacket pocket. He found 2 places where the chassis had taken stress marks from the ship's frequency, not cracks, but faint structural impressions, the metal remembering something it had been asked to hold against. He found in the sensor array logs a complete record of every position and movement and frequency signature the ships had produced during the engagement. He downloaded it carefully. He had an idea about what it might be worth later, when people who understood more than he did could look at it. Alina sat outside the equipment tent and didn't work. She had earned not working for a short while, and she understood that and let herself have it. She sat in the grass and looked at the sky that was now just sky again, and felt the various parts of her body reporting in from the effort they'd been through. Her hands were shaking slightly. She put them flat on the grass. Ranger Graves came and sat near her, not next to her, a few feet away, giving her room. He'd recovered faster than most of the others. He was older and had been through difficult physical things before, and had a kind of physiological resilience that helped. "You built that thing," he said. "With 2 other people," Alina said. "Did it do what you thought it would?" She considered this seriously. "No," she said. "It did something I didn't think of. That's different." He was quiet for a moment. "My sister is a structural engineer," he said. "I'm going to tell her about this." "Tell her the gate algorithm is the part that matters," Alina said. "Everything else you can work around. The gate algorithm is what lets you move." Graves nodded as if this made sense to him in a context larger than engineering. Maybe it did. The people who arrived were not police. They were not Forest Service. They had clean, practical clothing and no insignia, and they moved through the field with the efficiency of people who had been to other fields first, other versions of this same night, and knew how to contain the aftermath of something unprecedented. They took statements. They took the sensor array log when Marcus offered it, and the woman who took it held it carefully, like something she understood the value of. The man in charge, or the person most visibly in charge, anyway, found Alina sitting near the Hornet and stood a few feet away and looked at the machine for a long time before saying anything. "Is it damaged?" he said. "Stressed," Alina said. "Not damaged." "Can it do what it did again?" Alina thought about this. She thought about the gate algorithm and the actuator fault and the 7 systems that had been pushed past design parameters. She thought about what it had done and what it had cost, and whether the word again was meaningful in context. "Not today," she said, "but I can fix today." The man looked at her. He had a face that gave very little away, the kind of face that came from years of giving nothing away as a professional practice, but she caught something in it, not approval, not admiration, but a kind of recognition, as if she had said something that confirmed something he'd already decided. "You should come with us," he said. "Not without Marcus and Kala." "Obviously." "And the Hornet." A pause. He looked at the machine again. At its stress marks and its imperfect finish, and its salvage auction chassis, and its hand-fabricated circuitry, and its 18 months of accumulated human stubbornness made into steel and code. "Obviously," he said again. The gray room, the recording device, the man with the clicking pen. Alina Vasquez folded her hands on the table and looked at the camera and said what needed to be said, all of it in order. She said it cleanly and without embellishment, the way you gave a technical account. "Here is what happened. Here is what we did. Here is what the data showed." She said it without self-congratulation, because that had never been the point. When she finished, the man with the clicking pen asked, "The ships, did you understand anything about what they were trying to do? Long-term, beyond that night?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "They were trying to organize something," she said. "The people they'd taken, they weren't being destroyed, they weren't being killed. They were being organized, directed, like labor, like infrastructure." She paused. "We weren't the target, we were a complication in a larger project." "And now?" "Now they know we build things," Elena said. "Now they know we build things and put people inside them and go up against something we've never seen before and hold our ground. That's new information for them. I don't know what they do with new information." A pause. "I hope it makes them think." "About what?" Elena looked at the recording device, at her own faint reflection in its black face. "About whether this is the kind of job," she said, "where the complication is worth dealing with." Marcus Webb, 2 days later in the same room with a different interviewer. "The thing that people keep wanting me to explain is the algorithm, why it held, why it didn't fail under those conditions when it had failed under much lighter conditions in testing." He shook his head slowly. "I've been thinking about it, running the numbers, and the honest answer is, I don't know why it held. The update I pushed the night before corrected a specific error in the weight distribution calculation, and that correction cascaded into other parts of the system in ways I hadn't modeled. So part of the answer is luck. The specific error I happened to fix happened to matter most in exactly the conditions it encountered." A pause. "But the other part of the answer is that Elena was in it. And Elena, when she's in it, she compensates. She feels the machine through the haptic system and she adjusts in real time, faster than any algorithm because she's not running calculations, she's just moving. The algorithm held because it had her holding it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the part I can't document. That's the part that doesn't go in a spec sheet." Kalaosai, 3 days later. "You want to know what I was thinking when she drove at them? When she just ran at 2 alien spacecraft in an untested robot?" She paused. "I was thinking that I knew her. I was thinking that I'd watched her rebuild the primary chassis from scratch when the first version failed, and I'd watched her read fault logs for 3 hours trying to find a 10-millisecond error in a sensor calibration, and I'd watched her sit in the grass at 11 o'clock at night arguing with Marcus about whether the haptic vest preload settings were right, and what I understood was that the machine was not separate from her. She knew it the way you know your own hands. She wasn't driving it. She was using it." Kala looked at the recording device. "There's a difference. People who don't build things don't always understand that difference. The machine was an extension of everything she'd put into it, and she'd put 18 months into it. 18 months of not giving up." She paused again. "They came here and they thought they knew what they were dealing with. They'd done all their assessment and all their modeling, and they had their directed signal and their organized labor and their plan. They didn't put a giant robot made by 3 broke graduate students into their model." She almost smiled. "I don't think they were stupid. I think they were thorough and careful, and they did their research. I just think their research didn't account for what people will do when they're afraid and refusing to stop anyway." In the weeks that followed, the sensor array logs from the Hornet became the subject of considerable analysis. The frequency signatures the ships had projected, both the wide-field signal used on the population and the directed signal aimed at the Hornet, were studied by people with equipment that made Marcus's hand-fabricated boards look like something from a different century, which in certain respects they were. What they found was that the directed signal was a sophisticated manipulation mechanism, designed, as Marcus had guessed, for use on neurological tissue. It was extraordinarily effective on organic nervous systems and completely inert on anything else. The engineers who studied it noted that this was not, in itself, a failure of the technology. It had presumably worked on every prior target, every prior world, every prior population that had not had the particular combination of stubbornness and sleep deprivation and engineering training that had produced the Hornet. The manufacturers of that technology had, apparently, never needed to account for a machine. Alina read the analysis report when it was shared with her, 6 weeks after the night in the field. She sat in a different room by then, not gray, a room that had windows and morning light and a coffee she'd made herself. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, front to back, absorbing. When she finished, she set it down and looked out the window for a while. Then she pulled out a notepad and began writing. Not notes on the report. Notes on the Hornet, what needed to change, what needed improving, what the stress marks in the chassis implied about where the design needed to be stronger. She was thinking about the next version. She was thinking about what the machine needed to be able to do if those lights appeared in the sky again, and what changes would need to be made, and how long it would take and what she'd need. Marcus was going to have opinions about the actuator configuration. He always had opinions about the actuator configuration. She made a note to listen to them this time. The lights had not appeared again. Not in the 2 months since that night. Not anywhere on the tracking systems that had, in the aftermath, been quietly expanded and connected in ways they hadn't been before. The 5 ships had gone wherever they'd gone, whether they'd filed some version of a report, whether something somewhere had looked at what they reported and made a decision, whether that decision was final or provisional or subject to revision based on new information. Unknown, all of it unknown. Alina Vasquez sat in a workshop that had been a repurposed vehicle bay before she'd moved into it, and worked on the Hornet, and did not decide how to feel about the unknown until she had more information to go on. This was a discipline she had developed over years of engineering. You worked with what you had, and you thought ahead, and you built for the scenarios you could model, and you tried to build flexibly enough to handle the ones you couldn't. The machine was coming apart at the moment, in that productive way that machines came apart when they were being improved, panels removed, actuators exposed, wiring harness laid out on a clean mat to be inspected and rerouted. It was simultaneously more vulnerable than it had been in the field and more potential, the state of a thing that could be better if you worked. She was working. Marcus appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, the way he always did, the way he had done every morning for 3 years, as if this was just another morning in the lab and they were just working on the thing they were working on. He set 1 cup on the bench near her and looked at the Hornet's open chassis. "Left hip actuator is back in," he said. "I know I put it in. The preload setting is correct this time. I checked it 4 times. He nodded. He picked up the sensor array panel that was lying on the bench and turned it over in his hands. "I've been thinking about the range. If we could get it to 60 meters. 80, Alina said. "If we're doing this 80 meters. Marcus was quiet for a moment. 80 meters, he agreed. He sat down on the bench across from her and started working, and for a while neither of them said anything, just the sounds of tools and the machine and the morning light coming through the vehicle bay's high windows and the ordinary industry of 2 people who had decided, collectively and without much drama, that the work was not done and that they were going to keep doing it. The Hornet sat in its frame, partially disassembled, waiting to be better. They were making it better. That was the thing about being human, the thing that had surprised those ships, the thing that apparently hadn't been in any of their models, the thing that couldn't be administered through a directed signal or organized by remote instruction. The relentlessness. Not the heroics, not the moment of glory stuff, not the charge across the field at something that outmassed you by 6 orders of magnitude. The morning after, the workshop, the cup of coffee and the notepad and the 80-meter sensor range and the preload setting you were going to check 4 more times just to be sure. The getting up and getting back to work. That was the part they hadn't planned for. Alina Vasquez drank her coffee and kept working, and outside the window the sky was just sky, clear and cold and ordinary, and she worked until it wasn't morning anymore.